Chapter 7: When Spirituality Becomes Entertainment. Spirituality has always contained mystery, experience, contemplation, ritual, and transformation. None of these things are inherently problematic. The problem begins when the experience of spirituality becomes more important than the transformation spirituality was intended to produce. In a culture increasingly organized around attention, novelty, stimulation, and consumption, spirituality can easily become another form of entertainment. The seeker moves from one teaching to another, one teacher to another, one technique to another, one revelation to another. The search can become endless, while the person doing the searching remains largely unchanged. The spiritual marketplace does not necessarily need to convince people of falsehoods. It only needs to keep them interested. And this creates a subtle distortion. The question quietly changes from what is transforming my life to what spiritual experience comes next. Constant novelty. Modern spirituality exists within an environment of extraordinary informational abundance. A person can encounter Hindu philosophy in the morning, Buddhist meditation in the afternoon, Taoist concepts in the evening, and a prediction about planetary frequencies before going to sleep. There is always something new, a new teaching, a new frequency, a new portal, a new energetic shift, a new prediction, a new revelation, a new interpretation of ancient scripture, a new explanation for consciousness, a new method for awakening. The problem is not that these ideas exist. The problem is that novelty itself can become addictive. The seeker begins to assume that spiritual progress requires continually discovering something that was previously unknown. Yet many traditional paths emphasized almost the opposite. Return to the practice, return to observation, return to discipline, return to ethical conduct, return to meditation, return to prayer, return to self-inquiry, again and again. Transformation rarely requires an infinite supply of new information. It often requires sustained engagement with a relatively small number of truths. The modern seeker may therefore suffer from a strange abundance. There is too much to learn and too little time to assimilate what has already been learned. Information accumulates. Understanding does not necessarily follow. 3 seconds. Endless techniques. The same pattern appears in spiritual practice. A person discovers meditation, then breath work, then chanting, then visualization, then kundalini practices, then energy healing, then sound healing, then plant medicine, then manifestation, then another meditation system, then another teacher, then another initiation. The collection itself begins to resemble progress, but collecting techniques is not the same as practicing them deeply. A person can possess 20 spiritual methods and have integrated none of them. There is a difference between experimentation and cultivation. Experimentation asks, what else can I try? Cultivation asks, what happens if I stay with this? Traditional disciplines often depended upon repetition precisely because repetition exposes the practitioner to aspects of themselves that novelty conceals. The beginner experiences excitement. The dedicated practitioner eventually encounters boredom, then resistance, then impatience, then doubt, then subtle forms of attachment. This is where practice becomes revealing. If someone constantly changes techniques whenever the initial excitement disappears, they may continually escape the very depth that sustained practice could have produced. The spiritual path becomes a sequence of beginnings, never a maturation. Chasing mystical experiences. Mystical experiences can be profound, visions, altered states, powerful meditation experiences, kundalini phenomena, synchronicities, psychedelic experiences, states of unity, extraordinary dreams, moments of overwhelming presence. These experiences can radically alter a person's understanding of reality. They can also become objects of attachment. The person begins seeking the experience rather than investigating what the experience revealed. This distinction matters. An experience can be extraordinary without necessarily producing extraordinary character. Someone may experience profound unity and still become judgmental. Someone may experience overwhelming compassion and later behave selfishly. Someone may experience ego dissolution and subsequently construct a powerful spiritual ego around having experienced ego dissolution. The experience itself is not the problem. Attachment to the experience is. A glimpse of something profound is not the same as integration. The important question, therefore, becomes what changed afterward? Did the person become more patient, more honest, less reactive, less attached? more compassionate, more capable of accepting uncertainty, more willing to serve, more capable of living without needing to feel spiritually special, the experience may have remained an experience. It may have opened a door without teaching the person how to live through it. 3 seconds. Addiction to inspiration. There is another form of spiritual consumption that is less dramatic but extremely common. Inspiration. A person watches another spiritual video. They feel uplifted. They feel clarity. They feel connected. They feel that something has shifted. For a few hours, perhaps even a few days, life seems different. Then the feeling fades. So another video is watched, another teaching is consumed, another inspirational message arrives. The cycle repeats. This creates a kind of emotional spirituality. The person is continually stimulated, but rarely transformed. Motivational spirituality can become a series of temporary highs. The seeker feels certain, then uncertain, inspired, then discouraged, connected, then disconnected, awake, then ordinary. The next piece of content restores the feeling. The problem is that genuine development cannot depend entirely upon maintaining a particular emotional state. Traditional spiritual disciplines were rarely designed merely to make a person feel inspired. They were designed to cultivate steadiness. The purpose of practice is not always to produce a beautiful state. Sometimes it is to remain present when no beautiful state is occurring. That is a much less marketable message. It is also potentially much more transformative. 3 seconds. The attention economy. Modern spirituality exists inside the attention economy. Attention has become valuable. Content competes for it, and spiritual content is not exempt. The teachings that spread most easily are often those that provoke strong emotional reactions: fear, hope, outrage, wonder, certainty, shock. A dramatic spiritual claim can travel much further than a careful philosophical qualification. Everything is energy. You are ascending. The frequencies are changing. You were chosen. A new portal is opening. Humanity is awakening. These statements are emotionally powerful. They create anticipation. They create identity. They create conversation. They encourage people to return for the next revelation. The algorithm does not ask whether something has deepened a person's wisdom. It measures attention, views, clicks, comments, shares, watch time. And once spirituality enters this environment, spiritual teachers and creators are placed under the same pressures as everyone else. The content must remain engaging. The audience must remain interested. The next revelation must eventually arrive. The spiritual message can therefore become shaped by the economics of attention. Not necessarily because the creator is consciously deceptive. The system itself rewards stimulation, and what is rewarded tends to multiply. 3 seconds. Performing awakening. Eventually, spirituality can move from something being lived to something being displayed. The person announces their awakening. They describe their frequency. They publicly identify their level of consciousness. They display spiritual symbols. They photograph retreats. They broadcast meditation. They document transformation. They explain their latest realization. There is nothing inherently wrong with sharing spiritual experiences. Communication can be valuable. The question is what happens when the audience becomes part of the experience. Awakening becomes something to demonstrate. Consciousness becomes something to communicate. Spirituality becomes an aesthetic. The person does not merely experience transformation. They begin producing evidence of transformation for others to see. This introduces a strange paradox. The spiritual path traditionally asks the individual to become less dependent upon recognition, yet the attention economy rewards recognition. The person can therefore become caught between two opposing movements. One movement says, let go of the need to be seen. The other says, show people who you are becoming. The second can quietly rebuild the very identity the first was attempting to loosen. The spiritual self becomes a public performance, and once transformation becomes performance, maintaining the appearance of transformation can become more important than undergoing it. When awakening becomes something to display, there is a particularly subtle danger here. A person may begin by genuinely experiencing something profound. They then tell others. Others respond positively. The person receives recognition. Recognition strengthens the identity. The identity creates expectations. Now the person must continue appearing awakened. The original experience may have been authentic. The identity built around it may still become a prison. This is one reason traditional teachings repeatedly placed emphasis on humility, not because spiritual experience is meaningless, because the mind can appropriate almost anything. Knowledge can become status, renunciation can become status, humility can become status, silence can become status. Even the absence of identity can become an identity. The ego is remarkably adaptable. It does not always need to reject the spiritual path. Sometimes it simply learns how to wear spiritual clothing. Experience versus transformation. The distinction running through this chapter is therefore simple. Experience is something that happens. Transformation is something that remains. A powerful meditation may last 20 minutes. Its effects may last much longer. A mystical experience may occur once. The insight may continue shaping a person's conduct for years. A spiritual teaching may be intellectually understood in an afternoon. Embodiment may require decades. This is why the ancient emphasis on practice matters. Practice takes what has been glimpsed and asks whether it can become lived. Can compassion survive irritation? Can awareness survive boredom? Can humility survive recognition? Can discernment survive uncertainty? Can ethical conduct survive inconvenience? Can a person remain present without needing another extraordinary experience? These are much quieter questions than those offered by the spiritual entertainment industry, but they may be closer to the heart of genuine development. The return to practice. The solution is not to reject spiritual experiences, nor is it to reject spiritual teachings, teachers, retreats, meditation, mystical traditions, or altered states. The deeper question is what role these things occupy. Are they becoming substitutes for transformation? Are they helping the person become more present, more ethical, more compassionate, more discerning, less attached, more capable of living ordinary life wisely? Or are they simply providing another stream of stimulation? The distinction is important. A person can spend years consuming spirituality without ever seriously practicing it. They can know the vocabulary of awakening while remaining deeply attached to recognition. They can understand non-duality intellectually while constantly dividing people into awakened and asleep. They can speak endlessly about surrender while remaining unable to tolerate ordinary uncertainty. They can collect techniques while avoiding discipline. They can chase mystical states while avoiding the transformation of character. The spiritual path then becomes entertainment with sacred vocabulary. The antidote is remarkably ordinary. Practice, repetition, silence, observation, ethics, riskless, service, responsibility, presence. Return again and again to what actually changes the way consciousness lives, because the deepest transformation may not feel extraordinary at all. It may simply become visible in how a person speaks, how they respond, how they treat others, how they handle suffering, how they behave when nobody is watching, how little they need to prove. 3 seconds. Central insight. A spiritual experience may change consciousness for a moment. A spiritual practice changes how consciousness lives. The experience can open the door. Practice teaches us how to walk through it. And perhaps the most important question is not, what did I experience? But what did the experience make possible in the way I now live? When spirituality stops being something endlessly consumed and becomes something quietly embodied, the search begins to change. The next revelation becomes less important. The next technique becomes less urgent. The next spiritual high becomes unnecessary. What matters is whether wisdom has entered life itself, because awakening that must constantly be announced may still be seeking recognition. But transformation that has genuinely taken root often needs very little advertisement. It simply begins to show itself in conduct, in attention, in relationship, in responsibility, in compassion, in freedom. And perhaps that is where spirituality stops being entertainment. It becomes practice. It becomes life.